At 14 years old, Jamie Clark is told the unthinkable. Her father is murdered. She's sent into a tailspin for the next 29 years because she says her rights as a victim were tossed aside by the system built to protect her. As a child of divorce, Jamie Clark didn't get to spend much time with her father, Robert. When she turned 14, she planned to move into her father's home in Sawyer County.
And I was ultimately going to decide to live with my dad.
A plan that changed October 13th, 1995, when a police cruiser arrived at her home.
Approached me and my friend. We were outside playing.
It's a day Jamie will never forget.
Like somebody is really ripping your spine right out of you.
Detectives found Robert Clark shot to death in his bedroom.
I just felt like my world was at an end.
The next 2 years of court proceedings were a blur. Jamie doesn't remember much as the trials played out in court, and that may have been intentional.
Some of the brothers and sisters were listed as victims. My grandparents were listed as victims, but not me.
Her voice is never heard in court.
These victim rights that I had, even as a child, as an adolescent, were thrown away.
Those rights are spelled out in Marsy's Law. The right to be heard in court, to be notified of court updates, to have direct input in parole considerations. Wisconsin didn't adopt it until 2020, but attorneys say victims had those rights before then. No one seemed interested in telling that to 14-year-old Jamie.
And all they could say was, "I'm sorry, I dropped the ball with you." Well, you weren't the only one that dropped the ball with me. The state of Wisconsin did.
The evidence still convicts David Layton and Jared Ham, who are sentenced to life in prison.
My dad was my favorite person, and I lost him forever.
That loss is torn open a dozen years later to see a documentary on her father's murder.
But Clark came back to town carrying some heavy baggage.
I feel like I'm reliving the trauma, like it's just a nightmare that I can't wake up from.
And then the nightmare returned a few months ago when a family member said Jared Ham was up for parole.
My other family members had known about this for over a year, and I was just being informed a week before he was being released. I felt re-victimized.
Jamie says she wonders how many other Wisconsin victims have had their rights ignored.
In the early hours of a prosecution, we're mostly working with law enforcement to figure out who's been affected.
But prosecutors know it's an imperfect system.
I've had cases where I didn't even know a victim had children.
It's why Jamie wants to see legislation bridge Marsy's Law with past victims.
Even if it's just being notified, it's important.
Her one chance came with a face-to-face meeting with Jared Ham.
We couldn't explain the bond that we created, but it was such a very deep, heavy conversation. I think we're both really glad it's behind us, and hopefully it's our first step to just moving on into healing.
An extreme step that came 29 years late, a timeline Jamie Clark wouldn't wish on anyone. Now, because these rights have existed for so long, the DA's office says it's essentially on attorneys and judges to do their best to leave no victim behind. Now, for those feeling left behind in the court system, the DA's office recommends sites like VineLink. It's a free anonymous service for people to track custody status and criminal cases in general.